Hey, animal allies. Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights and liberation activists who inspire us to get active for animals worldwide. Our guest on this episode is Jim Mason, author and longtime outspoken animal advocate. I want to announce right off the bat that our Ohio occurrence is happening August 29th through 31st, 2025. So please register and donate if you can. I'm Michelle Granberg. Before we get into the episode, a little bit about AAC. AAC is a multinational program created to encourage activists to reach their potential and equip them with the tools, community, and resources they need to boldly participate in our global animal liberation movement. At Animal Activism Collective, our core goal is to eradicate the normalization of violence and oppression against all sentient beings by growing a culture of empathy and compassion. We do this through mentorship, education, support, and multi-pronged activism. Please visit our website and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and reach out to us to apply to become a mentor or mentee. So now on to our guest, Jim Mason. Jim and I talked about some of the history of the animal rights activism movement. We chatted about speciesism and how and why we as humans have lost our connection with animals. Please enjoy my conversation with the one and only Jim Mason. Hey, Jim, welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour. We've spoken several times, and it's always a pleasure to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to have you. So let's start as we dive in. What is your animal activist or animal advocate origin story? In other words, what was your personal impetus for fighting for animal rights?
Well, I was a pre-med and I studied a lot of biology. And then I didn't like the idea of the horrors of med school. So I went to law school where I learned about justice. So I had this unique education of understanding biology and evolution and similarities with animals, what I like to call the evolutionary continuity. And then when I got to law school, I studied justice and I realized that we don't treat animals with justice. But I didn't do anything about it. I just kind of teased my colleagues about it. I said, oh, we should extend the Bill of Rights to other animals, and everybody'd laugh. But then a few years later, I had a friend who had that famous bumper sticker from Friends of Animals. It said, I break for animals. And right at the bottom, it had Friends of Animals, 11 West 60th Street, New York City. And I thought, wow, that triggers me to do something. So the next time I'm in the city, I lived in the suburbs. Next time in the city, I'm going to go there and say hello. And I did. It changed the course of my life because I met Alice Harrington. Oh, God. She really was a great mentor. She drew me into being to working for her, to a part-time job doing activism for Friends of Animals, and I credit her in my book, which I think we will show at some point, for sort of introducing me to actually getting down and working for animals. So I did a job or two for her, and then one day she said, Jim, we've got to do something about this factory farming. And we'd heard about it and we knew about Ruth Harrison's book, but no one had written about it in the United States except for that chapter in Peter Singer's book. And by the way, I helped him with that. I helped him travel around and get the photographs. So Alice Harrington says, so why don't you and this, she's funny, why don't you and this Singer guy write a book about factory farming? Hello. So I wrote to Peter and he said, hell yes, let's do it. But let's make it mostly photographs because people will not be able to believe a description of these places. Words cannot describe them. So then I found a photographer and we traveled around, and there's a whole long story there. I won't give you all of it, but it took 2 months of visiting factory farms and taking pictures. And by this time, I was a vegetarian, not quite vegan yet. But so yeah, that's it. Alice brought me brought me in, sucked me in, and put me to work, and I've never looked back. And I always thank her because she rescued me from a boring, tedious suburban law practice. Oh my God, she got me out of that. I'm always grateful for her.
I can tell. I mean, I can really tell just
Yeah,
you talking about her. I know that you're moved, right? And you see her as this shining beacon and the role that she played in your journey and how
yeah,
that ripples out. And we do want to shout out to those who've come before us and those who have inspired us. And we hope to pass that forward, of course. And it's good to talk about the history of this movement and certainly put it in perspective. But let's continue with that a bit more as you sort of take us back in a time machine to the early 70s in New York City. And you say you met Peter Singer there. What did activism look like? Other types, what types of actions took place? Protests, sit-ins, boycotts, banner drops, marches.
yeah.
And can you comment anything about the early legislation, if you can, that still holds up today? Or
Well, in the early '70s, when I got active for Alice, it was still the animal welfare movement. We
mm,
hadn't heard the term animal rights yet. That was going to come on thick and fast because of the repercussions from Peter Singer's book, really set off a whole new way of looking at what are we going to do about animal cruelty. And we graduated from animal welfare to animal rights, and we're in the thick of it now. But the activism in those days was there was nothing on farmed animals. They'd never even considered it. One activist told me, "Forget about it. It's a mountain. It'll never be moved." So we focused on the cruelties of the fur trade, hunting, trapping, that kind of thing. And of course, some activists were exposing the horrors in the laboratory animals in labs.
yeah,
And so the protests that I remember were street protests against fur stores and fur fashion shows. I remember a bunch of activists closed up Macy's on Black Friday one year. We blocked the doors and the escalators as soon as Macy's opened. And there were hundreds of us, and we
mm,
basically closed the doors. And we all got arrested. But an hour later, the cops let us go. They were amused. They were kind of amused. They didn't want to deal with having to transport hundreds of activists someplace, so they just told us to go home. It was fun. It was a great day.
that's a good day when you don't get
Yeah,
arrested, when you get
yeah,
let
yeah,
go. Absolutely. And so did that make the media or anything at that time?
yeah,
Like, what was the
yeah.
public optics in response to? I mean, that's just one example but that's a day when you definitely did make yourselves known for the cause.
I think, yeah, it got press, and those protests focused on fur and trapping and fur farms. I think you've got to recognize they did make a dent. The the popularity of furs has dropped dramatically in American and Europe world. So yeah, we brought some change there.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the start of that. And we're continuing that today, but I guess the good news is that we have made inroads in terms of our, activism and winnable campaigns in terms of because public perception is mostly against fur. So
We
that is
made we made the cruelty visible. We were able to hide it.
right.
And what we're doing now with dairy and factory farming is make it visible. They're trying to hide this stuff.
Absolutely. Visibility is so important. So you have a new book out, which I have here.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, really wonderful book. And it's called Madness. And it's the deep driver of our climate crisis, lessons from my family farm. So I want to go into that now,
Sure.
starting with, in the book, you talk about a very early memory when you were around 4 years old, a traumatic experience where you saw the bloody body parts of a dismembered pig. And you were hysterical and crying unconsolably, and the trauma that you experienced caused nightmares. And from that point forward, your family would take you away from the farm whenever it was slaughter day.
Yeah.
But that painful trauma permanently affected you. And so looking back, that was a normal reaction to violence. But talk
Yeah.
about that experience.
Well, that was one of many. I had to stop writing up these anecdotes because growing up on a farm in rural Missouri in the 1940s and
Mhm.
1950s, it was a steady diet of abuse of animals, like in that way. So I went on, grew up, forgot about it, buried it. I mean, I never really forgot about it, but I just didn't think about it until I started working for Friends of Animals and became an activist and got into factory farming. So then all of that bubbled up, and I realized that something wonderful happened out of that terrible moment, which is why I wrote this book. Because of my knowledge of biology, I had this insight that we really do have feelings for our animal cousins. We have instinctual feelings for them as we do for, should have for each other. And they've been stifled and suppressed and pushed down by one thing in particular, animal agriculture. Animal agriculture could not go on if we didn't suppress the feelings that we have for animals. And it's become the basic culture of the West, what I call in the book agrarian culture, where we believe certain things that make it more comfortable to do the cruel things that I saw that day. So when I had that innocent child's reaction, I thought, that's the way human beings should be. They should be revolted, horrified by this. But because of agrarian culture, and the stories in the book are how little by little, year by year, they pressed this new, very old way of thinking, agrarian thinking on me. Like I remember I had a quote my dad once told me. I was complaining about some cruel thing, and he said, "Oh, well, animals don't feel pain the way we do." And, I bought it at the time. I didn't know any better. I was only maybe 8 or 9 years old. And my mother's family were, I'm the fifth generation from a farm family. My mother's family were pioneers. She was a farm kid. So, yeah, I come from a long, terrible tradition of farming mentality, of farming culture. And that's what's keeping us from having friendship and kinship with our animal cousins. Now, I got to say one more thing about that. This way of thinking has been impressed primarily on men because men have had to do this horrible work. It's the manly cowboy, tough. I told the anecdote in the book how we were about to go out and castrate the calves, and I started crying. I was kind of choke up when I recall that.
Yeah.
And my uncle said, straighten up and act like a man, or we'll send you back to the house with the girls. So men were taught to do the cruel stuff, but to be tough, to be manly, the cowboy. So that's the culture I'm complaining about in the book. And that's why I'm arguing in the book that animal agriculture, its agrarian culture, is hard on humanity. It stifles the better part of humanity. And men, unfortunately, I think men get the worst of it because it's forced us to do this horrible work and patriarchy. So if you're wondering why men are so terrible these days, you might look at this programming, this brainwashing that makes them stifle their feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And we definitely want to drive that point home. And as you pose the question, which is a good question for all of us to ask ourselves, because as you're saying, we all come out of the womb not wanting to harm
Yeah.
animals.
Yep.
We are conditioned to other animals. And, what if, as you say, what if that good instinct had been nurtured
Yes.
instead of stifled? Different
Ah,
track, such a different track. This world would be, individually we'd be, and as a world, what if, and what might humanity be like today if we nurtured instead of stifled empathy and feelings of kinship, especially for men, with our
yeah,
animal cousin? That
exactly.
I'm asking folks to stop and ponder that now, like right now. What if? What if that was nurtured? And
Yes.
what if we were nurtured toward kindness and empathy? How would it be different right now?
Yes. One of the things I often say is that we ought to listen to women because women are brought up to be more emotionally complete. A, a big part of the spectrum of emotionality is crushed in men so that they can be tough. And it started thousands of years ago. It was primarily men who were the hunters, and it was primarily the hunters who began to domesticate the sheep and the goats in the mountains, and then they had to do cruel things to them. So they had to be hardened to exploit animals. And then as we go into civilization, and I talk about this in the book, as agrarian civilization progresses and becomes more successful, these attitudes become ingrained in all of us. It becomes sort of the bedrock of the way we see the world. And I'm not happy with our civilization. I call it madness.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's why the title of the book really, really brings that home. And this might be a bit of a tangent, but maybe not, because I wanted to ask you, how can parents, because we're talking about children, right? How we start, we want to let your story inform really everyone, but parents in terms of how they respond to children's natural reaction,
Yeah, yeah,
animal violence. How can parents prepare their children for this world we live in where animals are harmed every day? But we don't necessarily want to shield them completely, do
yeah,
we?
yeah,
How do you explain in a way that will avoid the trauma,
yeah.
but be truthful about the reality?
Boy, you you have opened up a huge can of worms there. Pardon the
Yeah.
expression.
Ah,
That's a tough one. I don't know. It's a serious, serious subject, and it's something that parents are already contemplating, I'm sure, because we're in a changing world. We have to figure out how to bring them up with better, more progressive attitudes about sex and gender and sexuality and all of these things that are difficult to, because on the one hand, there's the pull of the established culture, which they're going to get from their friends and their peers, and the parents of their peers are going to be torn. For example, I am an atheist, and if I had kids, I would not let them go to church. I would not let them have any part of that brainwashing. And yet they're going to make friends with kids who do all of that stuff. So my poor kids, if I had any, are going to be in a conflict. And I wish I had the answer to how to deal with that. But I would leave those questions up to people who are more expert in the business of parenting than I am. But it is a problem.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's what vegan parents face every day. So in your book, Madness, the Deeper Driver of Our Climate Crisis, Lessons from My Family Farm, talk more about why you called it literal madness. You say a kind of madness arises from the prevailing nature conquering, nature hating, and self and world denial. So I think of it when I was reading it like a sickness that we
Yeah.
all got, we all have and don't know we have it. We're all physically and emotionally ill. And we can trace it back to this like addiction to grab power and dominion over nature. So talk about that as the main
Yeah.
thrust, madness as the thrust of your book.
Well, the title comes from a woman friend. I
Mm.
showed her the manuscript and it had different ideas. And she said, I think I think you're talking about the madness of the modern worldview. And I call it madness because madness is an old fashioned term for being
Hmm.
crazy. In fact, it's in the legal literature and the pre scientific studies on human insanity. They used to have mad houses where they put the criminally insane. So it's a word for mental illness, which is a way of saying being out of touch with reality. And I think our worldview is exactly that. We are out of touch with our place in the world. We don't have a clue about where we belong here. And some intellectuals call that alienation from nature. And it's a product of the agrarian culture, which wanted us to control. We used to be in awe of the living world before agriculture. We marveled at the change of seasons. We marveled at natural processes, the growth, the coming of spring, the changing of the seasons, and especially by watching animals around us, marveling at how they did some of the same things that we do and thinking of them as maybe relatives of a kind, you know. They couldn't speak, but they did everything that familiar to us. They were kind of like an extended family. And we were in awe of that, which is why the very first art in the world, the very first artwork is on the caves in France. They painted animals. Why? Because animals impressed them more than anything in the world around them. They were called animal powers, and we've lost that. When we became farmers and we subdued animals and we controlled them and we castrated them and dehorned them, we changed every aspect of their lives. We took away their freedom. And then we felt like gods. We thought,
Hmm.
oh my God, we thought we used to be in awe of these animal powers, and now we control them. So we're gods. And we invented a God that looked like us, who turns around and gives us a license to steal, or more real, a license to kill. Gave us a license to have dominion over everything in the world. And we believe it. Well, some of us do. I don't, but we believe it to this day. It's a side comment, which incidentally, since I was brought up in the church, a very churchy family, and I was brought up on all that Old Testament stuff, it actually helped me gain some of these insights. The Bible studies that I did for fun here lately actually empowered some of my thinking about this. And if you'll read Deuteronomy again, I often say on Blue Sky and Twitter that female slavery, women's slavery was the first slavery, and it gave the model for all other forms of slavery. And a lot of people have quibbled with that. But read Deuteronomy. Back in the days when all of those tribes, of which the Hebrews were one of many, when they were fighting over water holes and grazing lands, they wanted to wipe each other out. And Deuteronomy tells the story of how the Hebrews escaped slavery in Egypt to come to the promised land. And guess what? They find people there. They found the Midianites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and all these ites, other tribal people. And they wiped them out to claim the promised land. Now, this is not to slur Jewish people and the Hebrews. They were one of many. Everybody was doing this back then. It's anthropology. So anyway, I I dwell on that too much, but that stuff informed me as well because I realized that these attitudes about animals and slavery and the subjugation of women are very roots of our culture, the very roots of what we believe today. And some people tease me a lot about what is Jim talking about all this stuff 5,000 years ago? What does that have to do today? What that has to do with today is that's where these guys started, and there are reasons why they started. And we ought to know that. That's the root of these bad attitudes that we're battling now.
Yeah, absolutely. So few people talk about that history and how we got to where we are today, and it just really makes me feel like just we've just wandered so far off course.
Absolutely.
We are like literally and figuratively lost, and like the pendulum has swung so far, and you know we can point to all the roots of that. But as you call one of your other book, The Unnatural Order, where we've placed ourselves at the top and animals at the bottom and the natural environment at the bottom. And I do want to talk about, where, how what role religion plays in all of that, because it's just really so interesting. But, in the books you write, you do dive deeply into how we got here, this cataclysmic disconnect. And so we could say a little bit more about that. And I guess, what is your biggest fear or concern if we don't radically change our behaviors towards animals? Looking through, it's like a dystopian lens. Like, what will the year 2070, 2080, 2090,
Yeah,
2100 look like?
it's if you read the experts about the gradual progression of the climate crisis, it's getting worse by the year, by the month, really. Uh, I don't have to rattle off all of the indicators, but it's climate change is a lot of parts to it. It's rising sea levels, temperature of the ocean, which will wipe out plankton, which produce oxygen, um, changes in the rainforest in Latin America, some of which is because of animal agriculture, because they're trying to destroy the rainforest to create more pasture land to raise more cattle. So these things are happening very gradually, but very steadily, and they're happening in such a way that people don't notice them in their lifetime. They're happening a lot. For example, deforestation. Like nobody's seen it happening in front of them throughout our lifetimes and before. I had ancestors in Missouri, farmers, who used to tell me how there were a lot more forests back then, but they cut them down for all the reasons, lumber and to clear land for pasture. And they saw the decimation of the forest, and we know that that's caused the loss of a lot of wildlife. It's interfered with a lot of ecological cycles. There's drastic change going on. And I pitched the book toward that issue because I thought people have had enough of books about animal cruelty, even though there's animal cruelty discussed in the book. I wanted people to see that this climate crisis has deep roots. It has its roots in our view of ourselves as masters of the universe, as God's chosen animal, and not just an animal, but a very special creature made in the image of God. And then God turns around and gives us all of this. Here, I made this world for you. Do everything you want. Subdue the earth. Be plentiful. Multiply have dominion over, what is it, the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, the fishes of the sea, and over everything that creepeth and crawleth upon the land, which is to say, you're in charge, take it all. So it gives us a horrible worldview. And I must add, hasten to add, that we don't get it just from the Bible. We got it from the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians, and every other agrarian ancestral civilization had the same idea. It
Mm.
wasn't all about God. It was just read Aristotle. Aristotle, I forget the quote, I used it in one of my books. Aristotle wrote that everything was for the benefit of man. Everything was for the benefit of man. The world was all there for man to use. And wow, that is just as bad as the Old Testament, and that's the roots of our culture, male and human-centered worldview that separates from other animals whom we used to have in awe and used to regard as kinfolks. So we're really on a trajectory of increased extinction, climate change. We're altering the living world around us because we were told to do that, that it was God's command to do that. And now we've gone too far.
Gosh, it's so disappointing that we as humans aren't meeting our potential. It's just like, what is happening? What is the psychology behind that? It's, as you say in the book, it's a well-known fact that animal farming is destroying our environment, everything
Yes.
from the air to the water. And yet, there is this cognitive dissonance or this collective
Yeah.
denial or this
Yeah.
whatever willful ignorance that is happening with the majority of people. And maybe backtrack to define, in your words, speciesism and dominionism and human elitism as the psychological, roots of this where we are.
Well, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. As I said, the intellectuals of the 20th century were always whining and complaining about man's alienation from nature, but they didn't really look carefully. They didn't do the courageous intellectual work of, okay, what is this and what caused it? And my point in the book is it's because of exploitation of animals. When we subdued animals, we felt that we had conquered the world because animals used to represent the essence of the living world, the moving parts of the world. And when we took them under our thumb, when we enslaved them, it changed the way we see everything. And it changed the way we see ourselves. It changed the way we see ourselves in the world. And while I call the book Madness, is because that's not a scientific worldview. That's not biology. We are not unique in the world. We are just one of many animals, and we just happen to have this brain power that has brought us to understanding things. But that brain power is being wasted on religion, which gives us this madness of a worldview of seeing ourselves as separate and apart and very special and not of the animal world. We're God's creature. I remember one of the breakthroughs I had was in Sunday school when I was mourning the loss of a favorite dog, and I asked the teacher if I'd see him in heaven. He said, "Oh no, there are no animals in heaven. Animals don't have souls." Woo! I thought
Oh boy.
that's pretty harsh. So I thought that's no heaven to me. I don't want to go to a heaven without dogs. I became an atheist before church was out and have been. I was 17. So yeah, it's
Wow.
we have most of our worldview is a combination of the classical Greek, Roman, Persian civilization and the Hebrew theology as written in the Old Testament, and that's what most people today, I think, still cling to, unfortunately, which is why we have a climate crisis.
Yeah, the religious, view of this is so backwards in some ways that the pushback we get when we do outreach for animals is, the animals are here for us, to
Yeah.
use as we wish, as you say, dominionism, and the fact that people are told that they don't have souls, would, I know you have a not you're an atheist, so you may have much broader views on the nature of the universe in terms of that, but do animals have souls? How can we connect with animals as souls, Jim?
Yeah.
Because there obviously is someone behind those eyes. How people miss that is beyond me, beyond us, but right, that allows them to continue this disconnect.
What I think on that is I try to get away from the idea of souls because I'm not sure there's such a thing as a soul. I'm a materialist. I believe in there's two things in the universe, matter and energy, and we're made up of those two things. That's the physical world around us. So the idea of a soul, I don't think anyone has ever shown me a piece of a soul. We believe in it as some kind of a notion about something about a spirit, emotion. I don't know how to define it, but so what I do instead, I'm stuck on this idea of what I call, because I'm a scientist, a biologist, evolutionary continuity. We are animals. We have so much in common with other animals. I'm sick to death of all these scholars trying to distinguish us ourselves to set us apart from animals. Oh, they can't read, they can't write, they don't have language. That's not important. What we should look at is how we are alike, how we have the same affections, the need for companionship, sex, food, shelter, safety, all the things that are all around us. And if we were to connect with that, what we are like with our animal cousins, we'd be more comfortable on the earth. We would feel like we belong here and we wouldn't want to destroy everything.
Mm.
We would feel a part of the family of animals and we would feel kinship again. We would probably be in awe of them. But no, we don't want to do that because the culture wants to separate us from them, to denigrate them, to reduce them, to disempower them to us so that we can kill them and eat them without too much, you know, discomfort. That's an interesting subject too, Michelle, is
Yeah.
how did we start eating animals? And my theory, and I see it some in anthropology, it probably started as scavengers when we were still in Africa, when we were all black, by the way, we were all pigmented and we were living in the edge of the forest trying to find food. And we probably saw some true predators make a kill and then eat that meat.
Mm.
And if we were roaming around and were starving, it might have occurred to some of them, well, let's try that. And then when they found fire about 1 million or 2 years ago, and they learned to cook things, and then they could kind of go anywhere because you can eat meat anywhere in the world, but you can't eat plants anywhere in the world. When you leave your ecosystem, you might not know what plants to select to eat. So meat basically allowed people to travel widely and exploit new ecosystems where there was maybe no plant life in the winter. So it's part of our history, and it's a sorry thing that we did that. And then, of course, because of our craving for meat, because it's
Mm.
become such a part of tradition and diet, we had to figure out ways to raise animals to kill them for this. So we have a long history of this practice of living off of animals for food. And now we know we can leave that behind. It's not necessary. If it was ever necessary. It wasn't ever really necessary. It was convenient if we wanted to leave Africa and go to Central Asia or to the Far East.
Mm.
Having meat in the diet probably enabled that movement. So so
Yeah.
it allowed us to spread all over the world, which is not exactly a good thing, is it?
Not a good thing.
No,
And so,
we
as you were
should.
talking about religion, I was thinking about religious sacrifice.
Yeah.
I know you're right about that as well, and that continues to subconsciously perpetuate our view of animals. I know there's still some animal sacrifice today in some religions, certainly not as much. And also, you were featured in Christspiracy, the documentary,
Yes. Yes.
and so what did you think of Kip and Cam's premise that Jesus was actually trying to stop religious animal sacrifice in the church? Do you agree? Or are you just sort of
Ah,
in the mystery of that?
I'm not much of a theologian.
Right.
My take on animal sacrifice was that it was a transition from the hunting of animals for meat to the raising of animals for meat. It
Mm.
was a necessary transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture because when we moved into farming and we had animals under our control, we still had, again, it's evidence that we were still queasy about killing them because they were familiar to us. And we still had these really old ideas about the animal powers and the animal kinship. So to kill them wasn't easy. There was discomfort there. So my theory is that animal sacrifice evolved as a way to kill them for religious reasons. And I gave examples in the book about how the killer, whether it was a priest or some other figure, had to apologize to the animal. It's part of the ritual to
Mm.
bend down and whisper in the animal's ear, I don't want to do this, but the gods want this done. I'm doing it because the gods want me to. And this wasn't Christians that did this. It was Hebrews and their peers in the early years of the agricultural spread of civilization in the Middle East. And the Greeks did it, the Romans, they all had animal sacrifice because they think they had to have a way to kill animals with some religious, fuzzy, mystical nonsense to make it seem okay.
Mm.
The gods want this. So, yeah, so clearing the animals sacrificed out of the temple, that's an interesting subject. I'm not sure I agree with all of the theology and the explanations, but I think it came to a point where animal sacrifice had to be phased out for economic reasons because they couldn't kill enough animals fast enough to feed everybody. If you had the occasional sacrifice in a temple, it didn't go that far. You needed to have slaughterhouses and professional killers. So there had to be a change. As agrarian culture spreads and as there is more and more reliance on killing animals and using their parts, we had to have a more secular way of doing that, which is what we have today, a mindless, no ritual, no religious significance, no emotional connection. Basically, it's all hidden. That's what we do today. We hide it so it doesn't upset people.
Yeah, so you explore animal exploitation as a feminist issue in depth in your
Yeah,
book. So
yeah,
talk again a little bit about that and relate it to animal husbandry
yeah,
and the dairy industry.
yeah. Well, I have this far out theory, which I find some references for in anthropology, that it was at some point in history we had to come to understand that men, when they have sex with women, they cause pregnancy, or the woman gets pregnant because of the sex act. Semen finds the egg, et cetera, et cetera. This is wasn't known to the forager hunter gatherer people. The act of sex was 9 months away from the event of birth, so they didn't necessarily connect the two. They didn't really have any way of knowing in the real world way of knowing that men having sex with women cause pregnancy, and
Right.
then so the birth was a woman's mystery. Women were accorded powers, mystical powers, the goddess figure, the power to give birth. And another thing I think is interesting: women menstruated, women bled monthly but did not die. This had to be a very powerful thing to these forager people because blood was thought to be the essential material of life, life blood. And when women could do this month after month and not die, they were in awe of women. Women had power. But then when we get to the agricultural period and we're enslaving animals and killing them and doing husbandry, which is what is animal husbandry? It's controlling the sex lives of animals. It's choosing which males get to be in the pen with which females to produce more wool or more milk. So the stuff that I've read says that it was at that point in history when we began to understand the role of males in reproduction. And that's when patriarchy takes off because now all of a sudden the powers that women had from their unique female reproductive systems and functions and processes wasn't so awesome anymore.
Mm.
It's just become like, okay, well, men caused this pregnancy and birth. So men want to take the power that women had. So you get the emergence of patriarchy, which is the idea that males rule. In fact, it means patriarchy comes from the, is it Greek or Latin for male rule, male rulers, male power. And so that comes with animal husbandry, which begins to occur within a few millennia after animal domestication, which is now about 10 or 11,000 years ago. And then we get the emergence of patriarchal cultures and patriarchal gods. And we see the suppression of the female deities, the goddesses, begin to get pushed down in importance, and the male deities emerge until we get Jehovah, the great man god in the sky.
Mm.
Full blown patriarchy we've had ever since. And a part of patriarchy, I write about this too, was the enslavement of women and girls. When all of these male led tribes were conquering each other and wiping each other out, competing for resources in the form of water holes and grasslands because they were all shepherds. They herded sheep, goats, cattle, horses, herd animals. So they had to fight each other constantly to get the piece of the environment that would support their herds. And as part a part of conquering each other, they they killed everybody except the women and the girls.
Mm.
They took the women and girls as booty, the spoils of war. And it's, again, read Deuteronomy. It tells you all about it. When Moses brings them to the promised land, he tells them to wipe out the Midianites and kill every man, but save the livestock and the women and girls. It's in the Bible. That's the way we used to live. So my theory, which some think is far-fetched, outrageous, but there's some support for it in anthropology. Women were the first slaves. Slavery becomes an institution because of these wars of conquest. When it became normal and acceptable and even glorious to wipe out somebody and take their women and girls and their livestock. We see the similarity of animal slavery and women's slavery at the same place, at the same time, and the same warfare. So there's definitely an association there in history. So whenever people complain to me today about women's frailties and foibles and how they do this and that and they're bad and they're, all the misogyny, I say, well, okay, bear in mind that women have been enslaved since about 6000 BC. They're slave class. They've lived under the prejudice of being slaves for sex. So that may help you understand the status of women today, the descendants of slaves,
Yeah.
and the ways of coping with living in enslavement, the methods, the ways of coping with powerlessness. So it's something to think about.
Absolutely. And we can see in front of our own eyes the ramifications of that on social media and in the movies. I mean, we can connect all the dots to our modern world and
Yeah,
how women are portrayed and how they're treated. But Jim, it feels overwhelming when we talk about it a little bit.
yeah,
To me,
yeah,
like
it is.
it's so big, it's so
It
big,
is
it's
big
so
and deep
entrenched as a
and
belief
deep.
system.
Yeah,
What do we
yeah.
do? What do we do? There's no answer. There's no one answer. We're talking about it. You
Keeps
know,
me awake.
what do we
keep,
do? What do we tell our young girls?
keeps me awake nights.
Oh my gosh, me
It does,
too.
literally.
Oh, we just got
Yeah,
to keep on keeping on. But Jiminy Crickets, I mean,
I think we do. I think we have to do what we're already doing, which is
right.
show it more, expose it. Uh, when I started activism, nobody ever mentioned anything about farmed animals. They didn't show pictures of factory farms. All of that was kept away from people, as well as the horrors that go on in laboratories. But activists began to infiltrate places, get the information at the source of the cruelty, take pictures, take videos, expose them. Thank goodness, I was about to say thank God, but wait, I don't believe in God. So anyway, it's one of the good things about social media and the internet is now we can show this stuff and we can show how horrible it is and take it away from being kept in hiding by the exploiters. I think we just keep doing that. I think we just keep showing what's going on and talking about it and make sure that the kids are brought up not brainwashed, that this is in any way necessary. We could identify as activists some of the most unnecessary. They're always trying to argue that this is necessary, that somehow human society would disappear if we didn't do this. Well, there's lots of forms of animal exploitation that there's no way they could be seen as necessary. I saw a thing the other night on one of the shows about a snake breeder whose snakes got loose. It's not necessary to breed snakes for pets. That's absolutely unnecessary to do that. And it exploits animals in the most horrible way. And the other thing is, one of the more spectacular cruelties is the things that they're doing in Spain to bulls and animals for public festivals. Those are not necessary. Human society is not going to die out if we quit doing that. So let's identify all the things that people are doing to animals out of tradition but not necessary, and expose the unnecessity of those things. They can't be defended anymore as being necessary. Not that eating meat and laboratory stuff is necessary. I'm not acknowledging that. It's just that some exploitations are so obviously, vividly, patently unnecessary, they should be exposed. That
Yeah.
stupid horse races and that sled dog race, that's entertainment. That's not necessary.
Yeah, and rodeos and
Yeah,
bullfighting.
exactly.
And so the hopefulness that I'm going to take from what we're saying right now is that we're passing the baton to the next generation, what
Yes.
we're doing now, and that exposure of the information is an important, vital, necessary part
Yes.
of this movement. It's a phase. I think when they talk about phases, typical phases of a movement, like, civil rights movement and women's rights movement, like we're in the phase of pushing and exposing, getting the information out there. But geez, it's just so slow. It's not fast enough for those who are oppressed and suffering right now. And we would love for it to speed up, because for it to take so long for us to evolve, wake up, become
Yeah.
enlightened in this way, but what else can we do? With knowing the way that change takes so long. So we've talked about sexism quite a bit here. Let's move to racism. We're
Yeah.
talking about the isms,
Yeah. Yeah.
these are all wonderful isms. No, but for you have a theory on how speciesism, animal exploitation, is connected to racism, or do you want
Yeah.
to share anything around that?
Yeah. I think part of agrarian culture is hostility to nature and anything natural. Uh, the Puritans hated the wilderness. And I like to break down the word wilderness. It means, from Old English, place of the wild beasts. They feared it. It scared them. It was full of dangerous animals and darkness. So this is the attitude that agrarians always had from the get-go. They want to control nature, so they don't like uncontrolled nature. It scares them, it bothers them. So when Europeans primarily explored the quote new world, what did they encounter? Wilderness. And when they found people there, they didn't regard them as people. When Columbus and his shipmates found the Indians, the Native Americans of the islands and Central America, there was a big debate whether they were animals or subhumans. And the Catholic Church, bless its heart, was the liberal force back in those days because they saw, well, they might have souls. They're not animals. They might have souls. Let's use them for a while and enslave them. And so, when point being, when civilized Europeans, Western civilized, agrarian cultured human beings came to wild places, when they encountered the continents that weren't exploited yet and they saw people, they began to think they were animals. And the same thing happens when we begin to explore Africa. We find these human beings who look very different from us, and they have different clothing and different habits and practices, and they lived in a wilderness. So they were treated as animals. They were regarded as animals, and that made it easier to enslave them. The first attitudes about slavery were, well, they're not exactly human, you know. In fact, they had different words for slaves. If you've ever seen those horrible little posters announcing slave auctions, they didn't talk about a man or a woman. They called black men bucks. Black women were called wenches, Wench. So you'd see a poster in what's a port in South Carolina where they brought them in. Anyway, a coastal town. It was a big slave trade port. They'd have these posters that said, for sale, 12 bucks and four wenches in good health with perfect teeth. That's how they advertise them like livestock, like you might say, three mares and a stallion and a cow and a bull. They were livestock. So racism is exacerbated by slavery because to maintain and slavery as a working commercial institution to make it work, it takes extraordinary brutality because slave people do not want to be confined and they don't want to be forced to work by violence and brutality. So the slave keepers in the South had to be extraordinarily violent and brutal to these people to keep them from running off. And so many of them did run away. And if they were caught, they'd chop their foot off or their hand off. It was a brutal system because that was the only way you could have some kind of control over people that lust for freedom. So, yeah, we have a horrible tradition of it here in America, and it becomes transformed from the attitudes of the slave masters and slave society. It becomes Jim Crow. Once the slaves were freed, white people did not like the idea of having to share the community with these slaves, these former slaves, enslaved people. They looked different. So we had Jim Crow. So we have the dividing of people on racial lines. If they look different from us, they're not us. And we love to do this with everybody. We do it with the Native Americans. We do it with Asians. We're always trying to distinguish ourselves as somehow special and better than someone else. It's pretty awful.
It's
I don't know
awful.
how in the hell we are able to use the word humanity with a straight face sometimes.
Yeah, and it's making me think a million things, and all this feels very born of like insecurity. Like the human ego
Yeah,
needs to pump themselves up that badly that we need to
yeah,
mercilessly oppress, populations and animals and all of that. And of course, I'm also thinking when you talked about the wilderness, what would the world be like without wilderness? Like
yeah,
that's the dystopian future. Like without trees and animals, devoid of that. If the planet, it's like those sci-fi movies
yeah, yeah.
where everything is metal and steel and glass, and I can't
So,
watch those because it just feels awful and just so angular and so
yeah,
dark. Like,
yeah.
hey,
We're
folks, that's not the world we want. We
an
want
artificial world.
we don't want an artificial world, man-made world, everything, and we'll just look at pictures of animals and how it used to be,
Ah,
pictures of trees when there's no more trees, and just absolutely
Michelle,
awful. And
before we leave slavery, I always want
yeah,
to say this in connection with the madness of civilization. We are worshipful of the temples and the sculpture and the artwork of the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and the Egyptians. How many people think or even know that that was all built by slaves? Those
mm,
are
mm,
the trinkets, the pretty stuff, the impressive structures dreamed of and actually built by slaves. Enslaved people did that. When we look at that Greek temple, the Parthenon, Greece was a slave society. I think in Rome, one out of four or five people was an enslaved person. So when you get to wondering about the glories of our wonderful, beautiful civilization, oh, those temples, that architecture, the Roman roads, slave society built that. Brutality built that. And the
mm.
wealth that they accumulated, the wealthy Romans from all their trade, trading with slave based societies too. The grain that the Romans got rich on came from Egypt, where they had enslaved people. So our madness of our civilization is ain't so pretty when you really look at the roots of it. And this is hard to take for people. They don't want to be
Yeah.
aware. It's unpleasant to be aware of these facts, but I think it's part of knowing how we got this bad, knowing how things have come to this, to know this bloody history we have.
Yeah, and it's good to point out there we are in no way shaming people. We're saying people don't know what they don't know to some degree, but now you're knowing.
Right.
This is what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're trying to open your eyes right now, folks. So we don't want people to get defensive because that will go the opposite direction and people will
Yeah.
shut
Yeah.
down. But we were pointing out the hypocrisy, without judging it in some ways. But indeed, as you say in your books, people will give lip service to saying they love animals, yet our actions are more along the lines of hatred. And
Yeah.
you coined the term misothery,
Misothery. Yeah.
misothery, thank you, which is sort of you looked at misogyny and then you look at
Yes.
our treatment of animals. So talk about that a bit, why that term, what it means, why we should start using it more.
What does misogyny do? Basically, it creates disrespect for women, or worse. Not only do we see them as less than we men, but we attribute really horrible features to them. Oh, women are sneaky, they're conniving, they're bitches. We make them bad. We make them worse than equal. And we do the same thing with animals. I tried to think of a word that was similar to misogyny for what we do to denigrate, that is, to reduce the value, the importance of these animal cousins. And so I coined the word misothery, which comes from Greek. It means literally hatred of animals, animal hating. And because animals are so emblematic of the living world and nature, being the moving parts of nature, it applies to nature as well. So when those world explorers encountered the new world, they saw it with attitudes of misothery as well as racism. When they saw the wilderness, all they can think of is, oh, we got to cut through all this jungle that's full of all these slimy beasts and convert it to agriculture, which is what they did in the West Indies. They converted it to raising sugar cane using enslaved people from Africa. They deforested entire islands because they saw that as a waste of God's gift to us. Misothery, hatred of nature, wilderness, full of nasty animals. Bulldoze it down and raise crops using slaves. That's part of our history. And
Yeah.
having said that, we have to prepare people when they encounter this horrible information. I mean, it's kept me awake nights for years. I, I have been studying this stuff for 40 years. I'm not normal anymore.
You haven't had a good night's sleep
I'm
since.
a broken, I'm a broken man.
Oh,
I can hardly think straight. Yeah,
oh
it's
God.
it's it's painful to know this stuff. So I'm going to tell activists, prepare yourself to be angry and depressed as you begin, as women are. When you understand what's been done to you, you get kind of pissed off. When you look at the story of how you came to be enslaved and treated as subhumans, yeah. And the people who are the racial other, the people of other races today, they're kind of pissed off. And I would be
Yes.
too. I'm pissed off that I'm white.
Yeah. 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 We have to channel that anger. That's all
Yeah.
we can do. We can't stew in it, but
Yeah.
there's good reason behind all of it. And yeah, not to get too caught up in our first world problems so much, but we have to cope and we have to manage our emotions and we have to not get burned out. And so those are other issues that we encounter. The burden of knowing. Claire Mann
Oh,
calls
God,
it.
yes. The
She calls
pain.
it the burden of knowing, and you
Yeah.
can't unknow it once you've seen it. You can't unsee it. And so that awfulness is what got me out of my seat, got you out of your seat, got
Yeah.
so many activists I know off the couch, away from the computer and out into the world, trying to make a difference. So I think that leads us to my next question for you to talk about a bit, which is you were inside animal factories,
Yeah.
slaughterhouses, but what was it like to be inside? How did it affect you
Wow.
personally, or what was it like? What stands out for you about being within those walls?
What we think alike, because I was just drawing up this image, this memory of when Peter Singer and I first went out. He was in New York and I was in Connecticut, and I had a car, and he had located a veal farm and a battery cage egg factory. And he wanted to go there and take pictures. And I'll never forget the shock when he and I approached that egg factory. It was in upstate New York somewhere, and they had, I don't know, it wasn't as big as they are today, but it had 30 or 40,000 hens in cages stacked up. And when we opened the door and walked in there, we were so shocked. I really felt numb. I felt almost semi-paralyzed because it was like a sensory bomb. First of all, the smell is overpowering. You could hardly breathe. And then when you open the door and you get the sound of 30 or 40,000 hens, they're screaming. They're screaming. When you open the door and walk in that place, they all start cackling, and it's just deafening. Smell, sound, and just the sight of so many creatures confined like that. It's just such a shock. So that was the first one. And then there were so many more. Like I said, when I did years later, when I did animal factories, I traveled for 2 months and went to factory farms, hog farms, chicken farms, broiler farms, every kind. In, I think, 10 or 11, oh, more than that, almost half the United States. 2 months on the road in a Chevy van taking pictures. I got to where I almost became numb to it, like where I got used to the sights and the sounds and the smells, so that I couldn't allow myself to feel it anymore. I just did it in a kind of a daze because it's mind numbing to see that and smell that. And oh, the flies. We tried to go into that egg factory. There's clouds of black flies were like, anyway, it's a sensory bombshell, is what it is. It's just hard on you.
That's just another level of trauma. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
secondary trauma, of course.
Well, I think the trauma of my farm childhood, I often think that, I think I
Oh,
wrote about it too, that the fact that I was already desensitized as a farm boy made it relatively easier for me to go into those factory farms. If I'd have been a typical, city dwelling vegan activist, I think I would have fainted on the spot or killed myself or something. I would have been so shocked. But I was kind of already numb to animal cruelty when I did that. So, wow. Yeah,
uh,
those memories are kind of hard to draw up sometimes, but I feel like I have to because I have this sort of gift in a way of having that background, of having that childhood experience and activism. So it helps. It helps me do activism. I think it helps other activists to share my experiences about being desensitized, being brainwashed. That's what we're up against, the brainwashing.
yeah, the humane hoax, right? The
Yeah,
humane myth,
yeah,
greenwashing and humane washing and all of that. Now they've gotten better at not showing us, and putting a happy face, on these industries. And, as folks are listening to this, and we don't want folks to click away, but it's so easy to dissociate because you're right, it is
yeah,
so anti-humanity of who we are. And, the scope of it, the scope and the scale of it is, hard to conceptualize and wrap our minds around, but it is real. It is
Well, it gives
absolutely
us,
real.
but it gives us a dream, a vision, a goal, which is to recover the humanity that's in there. And this is why I look to women. I say that women, having been exploited by patriarchy, but on the other hand, also excused from the toughness and the desensitizing that's imposed on men who do the cruel work. We're supposed to man up, toughen up, be a man. Women are more complete, emotionally complete. Women represent humanity relatively untarnished by what we're doing to the world. And I think that's why it kind of fits in with Carol Adams and the animal rights feminists that talk about women have a culture of caring, the caring of women's tradition, women's culture, caring for babies, caring for others. And that's because I think women are relatively undamaged by the horrors of agrarian culture as men are by being toughened to do cruel things. Women don't like to do that stuff. So, like that day when I was supposed to go out and castrate the calves, and the uncle said, shape up and act like a man, or we'll send you to the house with the girls. And I thought, at the time, I've got to man up. I got to be tough. I got to experience this cruelty and not show any emotion. I would have been better to have gone to the house with my mom and my aunts and learned their emotionality instead of this brainwashing. But that's what my book is about. It's about how those childhood experiences of cruelty and the culture of toughening led me to write about how this is across our culture. This is our worldview. We are all brought up on a worldview that toughens us, makes us manly to exploit animals. So I think animal welfare, animal rights, animal freedom, whatever you want to call it, I think it's the key to having a better world because I think it'll make us see how it's
Yeah.
damaged our emotional range, how it's damaged what would be a humanity that's so much better than what we're passing on to our children.
Well, you could have become, after those messages you got so many times so early on when you were still forming, when you were a sponge, you didn't become just another tough guy, who was out there perpetuating the things that we're talking about. And so you are a really good example of, that balance between sensitivity and strength that we can all have a blend of in that way. And
Yeah,
we are in this sort of crisis of empathy where we're no longer
yeah,
walking in each other's shoes as humans, never mind walking in the hooves
yeah,
and the
yeah,
paws of our animal cousins. And this idea we talk about, like when I go to vigils, I haven't been inside any factory farms or slaughterhouses, but I've been just outside of them with the bearing witness with the trucks, and I'm
yeah,
seeing them
yeah.
right, and it's awful inside the trucks. Horrible as it is, it's worse inside. But bearing witness, we talk about being with our emotions and leaning into the pain because of the way it brings out our humanity and helps us to develop and be a more authentic voice that we can talk
Yes,
about. I've seen it,
yes.
and I've been there. We want to encourage people. People, do what you got to do. Whatever you're doing to help animals, it all counts and it's all wonderful. But Jim, talking about restoring the broken kinship, I mean,
Yeah,
that's sort of one way to do it, to see this is what
yeah,
our brothers and sisters in fur and feathers, what they're going through. We want to
yeah.
relate to that closely, not just our dogs and cats who we live with, and we relate to them so closely as well. But we need to heal our relationship with animals. And
Yeah.
I don't want to say they need to forgive us, but we need to redeem ourselves. We want to redeem ourselves. So talk a little bit about, how we've betrayed animals, but
Ah,
still we're poised at this place where we can change that. And how do we restore that broken kinship today? What can we do today?
well, I try to think how much we share with animals. I really do try to consciously contrast and compare. I see, like, when I see the videos on social media of animals playing, there's so many cute videos. There's probably so many of them that are amusing and kind of shallow and superficial, but I see them when I see the young animals playing with each other and chasing and wagging their tails. I think that's what we like to do. This is joy. We share joy with these animals. And in fact, this is a very scientific matter. We share the brain chemicals, the neurotransmitters
Mm.
in the brain that cause the feelings of joy. That feeling, that emotion is common. We share it with other animals. So I think we should appreciate that when you see those kitty cats and puppy dogs. And oh my God, it's to me, it's uplifting. It's uplifting to know that, yeah, that's why I feel joy like that, because I am a relative of those other animals. I descended or ascended from other animals, and it's in our genes. It's in evolution. That feeling of joy. There's a Darwinian purpose to it. It's survival enhancing. It's passed on because it helps those creatures survive. It helps them learn to use their bodies and their muscles. It's no freak of nature that animals feel joy. And we share that. So I try to think of those positive things as much as I can. I really try to trace out the very positive aspects of this kinship, that we share with animals. A pleasurable feeling. Oh, the feeling of companionship. You see puppies and kitties cuddling up together for warmth. They love to touch each other. They love to be petted. They love to be touched. We have that. We're animals. So I try to remember that when I see those. I call them heartwarming, and they're worming as well because they bore into you and you can't forget about them. They're just so adorable. And just when you see that and you feel that, just you realize, yeah, that's what we have in common. And then we destroy that by
Oh,
having a system to kill them and eat them. Is it worth it? Ah, we have lost so much of our humanity to have meat, milk, and eggs. It's killing us spiritually and emotionally. And by the way, the climate crisis is because of this attitude. We feel like we can destroy everything for our benefit. A sick idea, a destructive idea.
absolutely.
It's a
So,
sociopathic idea. The
yes.
definition of being a sociopath
Yeah.
is total self-indulgence at the expense of another. To feel good about causing pain in someone else. That's sadism and sociopathy. And that's what our culture is doing. It's causing pain and destruction around the living world so that we can live better. I hate it.
Yeah. Gosh, when you talk about like that, it just makes me shake my head and like want to pull my hair out because and scream how ridiculous
it
it is, how
it's
how what madness it really is to
it's
even
madness.
take living, breathing, beautiful, sentient beings who just want to be loved and love and be loved, and what we do to them, and we just have to. Good gracious! I keep thinking, are we at a tipping point? Is this as bad as it gets? It can't get any worse, and then it does get
Yeah.
worse. But we
Yeah.
still have to hope, more than hope. We have to, dig our heels into that we can go forward in this way. And I was thinking as you were talking, wouldn't it be great to have a course in school that was mandatory called like the joy of animals?
Something.
Right? Where
Yeah.
you
There
just
should.
you sit there as a kid over and over and
Yeah.
watch every week, every day you're going to watch these beautiful videos and just instilling the
Yeah.
positive, in that and reminding them in a way that is hard for that people won't forget that will stay with them. And it makes me think of when I go to sanctuaries and volunteer, really when I'm around any animal. My
Yeah.
animals that live with me bring me so much joy. And when I go to sanctuaries and see they're thriving and some are still with their families and what they've overcome and how they're still joyful and how they learn to trust humans again, all that beautiful stuff. And then I want to shout out to there's another documentary by Mark DeVries. I'm not sure if you were featured in Humans and Other Animals.
I don't think I've seen that one.
Oh, Jim, you would love it. You would love it. It's called Humans and Other Animals.
Okay.
And it's also about the comparison, how similar, how friggin'
Yeah.
similar we are in every way, humans and animals, no different. We're all animals. It's a spectrum of animals. and all the beauty, where that
Yeah.
comes together and how we're the same in that way.
You see,
So,
our distant ancestors, and I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago, way before we became farmers, way before the Ice Age, when we were running around in the plains of Asia or Africa trying to find food, we lived in the presence of other animals. True, some of those wanted to kill us and eat us. Mainly, we avoided them, but we did enjoy, in various ways, the presence of seeing animals doing just what you were talking about. I think that's where the idea of the animal powers emerged. There's a famous quote I mentioned in that book. That art historian, what's the name? Lord Kenneth Clark wrote a book, Animals in Art, I think it was. And he goes on and on about the paintings on the caves of the vivid images of these bulls and these powerful animals. And everybody's tried to understand what were they thinking when they did this. And some have said, well, they were hunters and they wanted to kill these animals and eat them. And others say, no, it was a religious ceremony. Lord Clark is the only one that understood it. He said they were admiring these animals. They were envious of their animals. They saw them as kin. In fact, the quote that I mentioned in that book, these are the most admirable of our kin. And they wanted to show their power and the way they saw them as glorious creatures on the walls of those caves. That's what we want to recover, to feel that again, to feel that way about animals. And we can't do that as long as we're enslaving them to be killed and eaten. You can't have this and that at the same time. So, this is why we say we have to be vegan. We have to become more conscious of what we're doing to animals primarily and the rest of the world. We have to have the burden, the pain of this awareness as activists and try not to get overwhelmed by it. I mean, it's going to be overwhelming for some, but we got to find a way to bear it. We have to be witnesses. If we're going to be good activists, we have to survive to fight for animals and bear witness to the cruelties, to their horrors. And we have to be able to, if they can suffer it in person, we have to be able to suffer to capture it and to show it
mm,
and to spread the word about it. So anyway, I just
absolutely. That's the least we can do. It's the least we can do. Animals are too good for us. I'm telling you.
yeah.
They're too good
So
for us, and not that we owe it to them, but indeed, I think we have to give them their own planet. They
yeah.
just get away from humans. Humans are the scourge, and give them their own planet, let them thrive and do what they want to do in that way. But we're going to wrap up in a
Yeah.
bit, but what message maybe do you have for the next generation of activists?
Uh, Join us, learn this stuff. Don't be intimidated. Don't be appalled and turn away from what's being done to animals. You have to do your part for them. You have to become aware. You have to be conscious of the burden of awareness. It's your job. You will have the ideas, the innovations. You will carry on a vision of animal freedom where we can restore animals to their habitat. I have this crazy dream. I live in the prairie states where they raise the corn and the soybeans to fatten all the animals in factory farms. And every time I drive through that country and I see that flat terrain, all devoted to feed grain crops, and I recall that it used to be native prairie, the tall grass prairie, the most diverse ecosystem in North America, the equivalent of the rainforest. And we wiped it out, plowed it under, destroyed diversity to create monocultures to feed animals for animal agriculture. It makes me sad and it makes me angry when I see that. So we have some of us who want to rewild, that's the word, rewilding, finding places where we can restore wild ecosystems, whether it be prairie systems. A lot of places they're trying to reintroduce predators, wolves, and in Europe and in the United States. This is a vision too. We need to pull back the boundaries of our civilization, such as it is, and allow more space for animals to be animals. and have diverse ecosystems the way they were before we destroyed them for animal agriculture.
Beautiful.
I want to see the prairie the way it was before John Deere invented that steel plow in 1830 and then plowed up the prairie. I I, I think that is a crime against nature right there.
Mm. Oh my gosh, yes. I want everybody to visualize that. And I love that term rewild.
Yeah, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of efforts for rewilding in this country and in Europe, and some among Africans. I have an African person or two on my following, and Asians too. So they're in India. There are parts of the world where they're like us. They're suffering the consequences of human exploitation and predation, and they want it reversed. They want it pulled back, and they want rewilding. So let's
Mm.
go there. Let's do that.
That is actionable. I love it. Those are great final words, Jim. So thank you so much. As we wrap up, you need to know how much your contribution means to this movement. And if you ever think, even for a moment, that you're not making a difference, I'm here to remind you that you are. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
a leading voice, paying it forward, and for the significant body of work. Again, I want to encourage folks to purchase Jim's books and gift them to others. They are worthwhile and essential reading on these topics. So, really, thank you, Jim, so much for your valuable time.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you. Read the book, recommend it to others, please.
Yes, thank you.
So long.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jim Mason. He has a head full of knowledge and a perspective that only someone who's been writing for and fighting for animals for decades can offer. I have to announce our next event is the Ohio Occurrence, August 29th through 31st, 2025. You must register, and please donate. Any amount is appreciated. Join us. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work, please consider joining AAC's Patreon. Even as little as $2 a month goes a long way in helping us expand our reach and increase our impact. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAC. You can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismcollective.com. Our work extends beyond mentorship to include collaborations and mutual support with other grassroots animal rights groups. So reach out to us to become part of the AAC community. As for our podcast, we will be taking a break, but 5 more new episodes will be released in the coming weeks and will be rejoined by Shreya and Trey. Here's a reminder: the animals need you. You don't need to be outgoing and loud to be an activist. You only need the desire to change the world for animals. Get active, live vegan, and inspire others. Until next time, this is AAC signing off.